Welcome to the Make It Make Sense podcast, where we do deep dives into everything interesting.
All right, deep divers, ready to dive in. Today, we are heading straight into the Sunshine State, Florida. You know, that place everyone's wondering about, is it still a swing state? What's going on with all the real estate there? We've got some really interesting articles lined up.
Yeah, should be a fascinating look at what's happening down there.
Totally. So we've got one from the Miami Herald, all about the Democrats and what their game plan is. Another from Politico. And let me tell you, they're not holding back. It's like a warning about Florida's future. And to wrap things up, we're going to dig into some real estate trends with Realtor.com.
Sounds like quite the mix.
Oh, it is. Let's kick things off with that Miami Herald piece. They really get into the heads of Florida Democrats, especially with the DNC coming up. I mean, think about it. Republicans have 1 million more registered voters. 1 million.
That's a pretty significant gap to overcome, no doubt.
Right. That's not just a gap, that's a chasm. But here's where things get interesting. The article talks about this, like underlying sense of optimism from these Democrats, almost like a, we've got this kind of attitude.
Interesting. What's fueling that, I wonder?
Well, they're seeing those polls, right?
Yeah.
The ones showing the Democratic presidential nominee gaining on Trump in Florida. Plus, get this, volunteer signups for the Democratic campaign. Way more than any other state? It's kind of amazing.
So a real surge in grassroots energy. It's definitely a sign of enthusiasm. You have to give them that.
For sure. But, and this is key, the article also mentions that national Democrats aren't exactly throwing money at Florida the way they are in other swing states. Less ad spending, compared to, say, Pennsylvania or Michigan. It's like
they're not quite convinced about Florida's chances.
Exactly. Like they're hedging their bets or something. So the big question is, can this grassroots energy actually overcome that? What do you think? Can enthusiasm beat out strategy?
It's a classic dilemma, isn't it? Enthusiasm is great, don't get me wrong. But it often needs direction, a focused strategy to really make a difference. And in Florida, you've also got that well-oiled Republican machine to contend with.
That's a really good point. It's like they're trying to win a fist fight with, just pure passion, but the other guy's got all the training and the fancy footwork,
Exactly. It makes you wonder if the Democrats down there are getting the support they really need to make this a fair fight.
It really does. And speaking of fights, that Politico article, they are not mincing words. It's like they're saying, hey, look at Florida. This is your future if. Well, you get the idea.
They don't call it a cautionary tale, do they?
They don't. And who better to deliver that message than Debbie Wasserman Schultz, right? Florida representative, former DNC chair. She knows what she's talking about.
And the article highlights her speech at the DNC. Pretty powerful stuff. She basically called Florida a testing ground for what she called Project 2025.
Okay, now for those of us who don't have political science degrees, what exactly is Project 2025? Because it sounds kind of ominous, right? Like something out of a sci-fi thriller.
You could say that. Think of it like this. It's basically a plan drafted by some pretty influential conservative think tanks that lays out in detail what they want a second Trump term to look like. We're talking everything from how the government works to, social issues, even foreign policy. And Democrats are looking at Florida and thinking, uh-oh, this is it. This is the preview.
Because of all the recent changes there.
Right.
With the laws and policies, that's the testing ground. And Wasserman Schultz is basically saying, hey, everyone, wake up. This could be you.
Exactly. She even called out those new abortion laws, the restrictions on LGBTQ rights, even that whole thing with removing climate change from state law. It's like a laundry list of everything they're worried about.
And she really drives the point home with that line. We can't let them do to America what they did to Florida. Talk about a rallying cry, right? It's like, come on, people, get it together. But speaking of things changing, that reminds me of that Move Buddha article about Blue Islands.
Ah, yes, those pockets of blue and a sea of red. Fascinating trend.
It really is. So for those who don't know, what are we talking about here? What are Blue Islands and why should we care?
In a nutshell, they're areas, often within cities or counties, that are seeing a surge in Democratic voters in places that are traditionally very Republican. Think of them as little blue dots popping up on a very red map. And the article specifically mentioned Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada as prime examples.
And it's not just a handful of people, right? We're talking about a real shift in demographics.
Oh, absolutely. These blue islands, they often pop up in places that are seeing a lot of growth, attracting younger voters, folks who are maybe a bit more liberal, drawn in by jobs and well, certain lifestyle, I guess you could say. The article even mentioned how migration to Atlanta, all those new people moving in, actually helped flip Georgia blue back in 2020.
Georgia. Who would have thought? Okay, so we've got these blue islands popping up all over. What does that mean in the grand scheme of things? Can all these new people actually tip the scales in those states?
Yeah.
Come 2024, could they make a difference?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's certainly a trend worth keeping an eye on because these newcomers, they're bringing their own political beliefs with them, right? Their own voting habits. So the big question is, can they really shake things up in these states that have been, well, pretty reliably red for a long time?
It's like a slow-motion political earthquake.
Right.
You might not see the effects immediately, but something's definitely shifting beneath the surface. And speaking of shifting ground, let's move on to something a little closer to home, literally. That Realtor.com article about Florida's real estate market. Talk about a roller coaster. Condo prices on the coast, they're dropping like crazy. But then, inland, single-family homes are doing just fine. It's almost like two separate realities existing side by side.
It's a tale of two markets, that's for sure. And I think it speaks to something we're seeing all over the country these days.
Right. Like that whole I can't afford to live near the beach anymore thing. But it seems like Florida's got its own unique flavor of that going on, don't you think? The article mentioned those sky-high insurance premiums, especially for condo owners. It's like adding insult to injury.
It's a big problem down there. Florida's insurance market is a mess right now, and it's a whole bunch of factors feeding into it. Hurricane risk, of course, but also all the lawsuits, the rising reinsurance costs, and condo owners, they're feeling the squeeze more than anyone.
And on top of all that, you have that whole Surfside condo collapse from a few years back. I can't imagine what that did to people's confidence.
Oh, I'm sure it's still weighing on a lot of minds. That tragedy, it really shook things up, led to a whole wave of new regulations, more inspections, which, are probably necessary, but they all come with the price tag. And guess who's footing the bill?
The condo owners, of course. So how bad are we talking here? Give me the nitty-gritty, the numbers that'll make me wince.
Well, the article mentioned some condo owners facing assessments of over $100,000 just to bring their buildings up to code. It's no wonder some folks are saying, you know what, maybe condo living isn't for me anymore.
$100,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be rethinking my whole life after that. And that's exactly what people are doing, right? Heading inland where it's a little easier to breathe.
Seems like it. The article talked about this noticeable migration pattern, people cashing out of those pricey coastal condos and snatching up more affordable homes further inland.
So it's like this domino effect, right? Prices fall on the coast, people move inland, and suddenly places like, what was it, Port St. Lucie, they're the hottest things since sliced bread.
Well, not just Port St. Lucie, but yeah, places like Ocala, Lakeland, even parts of the Panhandle are seeing a lot of new faces.
And for those of us who haven't memorized the entire Florida map, Port St. Lucie, it's a fast-growing city on the Treasure Coast, known for, well, being a little easier on the wallet and having a more laid-back vibe. It's like this ripple effect, These real estate trends, they're not happening in a vacuum. They're tied to insurance costs, safety concerns, dare I say, even climate change anxiety. It's all connected. It's like Florida's this pressure cooker of everything happening in America right now. You've got the demographics, the economy, the politics, all swirling around under this big old Florida sun.
Yeah, maybe a hurricane or two thrown in for good measure?
Exactly. But it's not just about Florida, is it? What happens there, it tends to, spread, like those ripples in a pond.
It's true. Florida often seems to be at the forefront of trends that end up shaping the rest of the country. So it's a good place to look if you want to understand the bigger picture,
So true. Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into the Sunshine State, what's the big takeaway here for our listeners? What should they be paying attention to as we head into, 2024 and beyond?
I'd say the key thing to remember is this. Florida, it can be a bellwether, an indicator of things to come. But it's also unpredictable. And the stuff we're seeing play out there right now, those demographic shifts, the economic anxieties, the political battles, those are issues that are playing out on a national scale.
It's like Florida is holding up a mirror to the rest of us, isn't it? Showing us both, like the good and the bad, the potential and the challenges.
Precisely. And as we move further into the century, understanding those forces at play in Florida and how they connect to that bigger story, that's going to be crucial for anyone who wants to really grasp what's happening in America.
Wow, you made Florida sound almost like profound. Also, a little scary, right? I mean, all that stuff happening at once. It's like, okay, picture this. We're all strapped into this roller coaster, right? And it's going crazy, twists and turns up and down. And there's this one person, they're in the front car, and they're just screaming their head off. They're both terrified and exhilarated all at the same time. That's Florida, isn't it?
That's a very vivid image. But I think you're onto something. There's the sense of, I don't know, excitement, maybe even hope mixed in with all the anxiety. Because if we understand these trends, if we're aware of the challenges, but also the possibilities, then we're better equipped to actually do something about them.
That's such a good point. It's a good reminder that we're not just along for the ride, right? We have a say in this, a voice, and we can actually make a difference.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, as you're out there learning and exploring, here's a final thought to chew on. We talked a lot about people moving around within the U.S., right? But Florida, it's always been this gateway for folks coming from all over the world.
True. So many different cultures and backgrounds.
Exactly. So how might that impact things going forward? How will those new communities navigate the, shall we say, evolving identity of Florida?
Ooh, that's a whole other deep dive right there. And on that note, we'll let you all do some exploring of your own. Thanks for joining us for this wild ride through the Sunshine State, a place that, let's be honest, never fails to keep things interesting.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Make It Make Sense podcast.